Good afternoon, and welcome to the Fiscal Year 19 Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements, CRISI, Grant Program Notice of Funding Opportunity, NOFO webinar. Today's speakers are all staff at FRA and include Francis Bourne, Amy Hauser, Nate Vomisil, and Andrea Martin. I will now turn it over to Francis.
Thank you, Mary. Today we're going to be talking about the FY19 CRISI program and do an overview. We'll talk about how to apply. We'll talk about best practices. We'll have a recap and reminders and then open it up for Q&A. So Mary, I think we're ready for our polling questions.
The first polling question is, what type of organization do you represent? A, state, B, interstate compact, C, public agency or publicly chartered authority, D, local government, E, Amtrak, F, industry or consultant, G, other. We'll give it a few more seconds. Our second poll question is, did you participate in any previous discretionary grant program webinars? A, yes, I've participated in a live webinar. B, yes, I've watched a recorded webinar online. Or C, no, I have not previously attended or watched any webinars. While you're answering those, I'll go over the results of the first poll question. About 20% are from the state in attendance. About 15.9% are with public agency or publicly chartered authority. 10% are from the local government. 7% are from Amtrak. 31% is from the industry or consultant, and 14% are from other. Okay, now we'll end the second poll. About 52% have participated in a live webinar, 7% have watched a recorded webinar online, and 37% have not previously participated or watched. Francis?
Okay, thank you, Mary. So this is the FY19 CRISI grant program, and the purpose is to improve intercity passenger or freight rail systems. We're on our third round of funding from Congress. This program was authorized by the FAST Act and also has funding authorized next year. We'll see what amount Congress decides to include in its final transportation appropriations bill for next year. In the meantime, let's talk about the FY19 CRISI NOFO. There's $244 million available. There's at least 25% that is dedicated for rural projects. That's $63 million of the $244 million that's available. This NOFO was announced 3 weeks ago, and you have until October 18th at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time to apply. So who can apply? There's a wide range of eligible applicants, and most of you participating today fit into one of these categories, either directly or by contract. I want to say a word about public agencies. If you're applying as a public agency or publicly chartered authority, please include a link to your authorizing statute in your project narrative, or include as an attachment a copy of your public charter from 1954 if it is non-blind. This is a broad category, and we ask you to explain this in your application. It slows down the process for everyone if we have to search for your authorizing authority because the eligibility screen takes place before the application evaluations, and to try and make sure that the evaluations are evenly distributed among the evaluation panels. In the last 2 go-rounds, it took some extra time to track down this information from a couple of public port authorities and county-created economic development commissions. Once you apply, we know you're eager to find out if you've been selected, but please help us help you in this respect. When we look at applications, we look at 2 things to determine eligibility. Is the applicant eligible and is the project eligible? So let's look at the list of eligible projects. There's also a wide range of rail capital projects that are eligible. And regional or corridor development plans, safety programs and institutes, and research and workforce development. Applicants are required to describe why their project is eligible in their application. Some applicants told us, we're an eligible entity because we're eligible, or the project is eligible because it's a capital project. That's not a description. It's okay to repeat language from your project summary here. If you're unsure about the eligibility of your project, contact us about the eligibility before you apply. But my first response is likely to be something like, please tell us why you think you're eligible. Please have an answer for that question before you ask. In the first two rounds, we saw some confusion on the Track 1 planning projects. Planning projects is statutorily defined, a regional rail plan or a corridor service development plan. Project-specific planning is ineligible. For example, a station planning project or a port rail master plan, those projects are not eligible. And I also have the reminder again here that at least 25% of the funds are reserved for rural projects. So now let's talk a little bit about federal match. The statutory requirement is that you need to come in with at least 20%. In-kind contributions can be accepted beyond the first 20%. There is a statutory preference for matching that's 50% or greater. And we're also looking at whether or not there's funding from multiple sources. Just as a little tidbit of information, in the last funding round, the matching percent was 57%. Here's a general overview of the evaluation and selection criteria. The NOFO states that applicants need to address how their project addresses the evaluation and selection criteria. Evaluators are going through each application and searching for how the application addresses each of these evaluation criteria, the technical merit and project benefits. These are statutorily required and is what we're looking for when we go through the application. If applicants do not pay attention to these criteria, it could negatively impact your rating on the grant program, in the grant application. In the last go-round, we saw applications with two extremes, submitting too little information in the grant application so that it's difficult for our evaluators to understand what the project's actually about, or submitting excessive or extraneous information while not providing information that meets the criteria just described. At FRA, we have technical experts and subject matter experts representing a wide swath of competencies on our evaluation teams. We have safety experts, civil engineers, environmental specialists, and economists. They are objectively reviewing numerous applications. We had 94 in the last go-round, so please make sure that you're clear and concise in answering the questions that are asked of you in the NOFO. With regard to the selection criteria, the administrator is the person who selects the projects with input from a senior review team. Evaluators present ratings based on both the evaluation criteria and the selection criteria. The NOFO outlines the statutory and administrative selection preferences and the key departmental objectives. Applicants who can hit all of these are the most successful. A successful application describes how the project will address a number of the selection preferences and key departmental objectives. Just stating that your project meets these criteria without concrete examples usually means that the project receives a low evaluation rating. It's difficult to overcome having all the letters of support in the world if an applicant is not describing the public benefits of their project. Public funds are for public benefits. Tell us what they are. Our evaluators wanted me to share with you this advice. You can write your own evaluation if you address all of the evaluation and selection criteria. As I mentioned before, you can help us help you as long as you follow the requirements in the NOFO. So let me turn to Amy for a review of some of the basics.
Okay, thank you, Frances. This is going to be a quick overview. It will look familiar to some of you who participated in our webinars, but particularly this will be for folks that are new to grants. So first of all, be sure that you take a look at the NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, that Frances talked about. This announces the grant opportunity to the public, and it provides information about the grant requirements, as well as those important details on how to apply. So be sure you look for that. If you go to our webpage, you'll see there's a link. It's in the Federal Register. So what's the information in the NOFO? Here's a list of the different sections in the NOFO. The ones that we're specifically going to go over today are those that are bolded, such as the eligibility information, application and submission information, and the application review information. So again, for those who are new, it's where do I start? So to find information about FRA's grant programs, particularly the grant program that where we're accepting applications, look on FRA's webpage on our discretionary grant programs. On that page, you can see the summary information about CRISI, and this is currently the only grant program that we have where we're accepting applications. That can change at any point in time coming up. We'll have some more. You'll see a link to the NOFO that announces the grant opportunity in the Federal Register. So once you go to the Federal Register, you'll be able to see that this notice was published on August 19th. Note the application due date of October 18th, and those applications are due at 5 p.m. sharp. If we receive any applications after that time, they will not be reviewed at all. So that's very important that you submit those applications early. Please do not wait to the very last minute because these are time-stamped and we take those time-stamps very seriously. Also, just as a note the CFDA number, 20.325. You can use that number as you try to find out more information in the application process. So now we'll move to another polling question.
This polling question says, do you have any experience using grants.gov? A, yes, extensive, B, yes, limited, and C, no experience. And we'll give that a few minutes, or a few seconds, excuse me. All right, currently we have about 25% who have extensive experience, 33% who have limited, and 40% who have no experience.
Okay, so this next section is primarily for those who have no experience or limited experience using grants.gov. So after you read the NOFO and you decide that you meet those eligibility requirements that Frances went over, you're going to need to access grants.gov to read the directions on applying electronically and finding other information about the grant opportunity. So one way to do that, you'll get onto the search for grants, and you can search easily by using that CFDA number, 20.325, to go directly to the opportunity. There's other ways to search for the FRA grants as well, but that's one way to quickly go to this particular grant program. And then you can then click on the opportunity number to see a synopsis of the grant program. The synopsis on grants.gov, it provides a summary of the information about the opportunity. And if you look above, you can see that apply button. So that's where you'll start your application. But do know before you do start your application in grants.gov, you have to be sure that you obtain a Dun and Bradstreet number or DUNS and register in the Federal Government System for Award Management, or SAM. That's extremely important. I strongly suggest if you are not registered or have your DUNS number, do it as soon as possible. Entities that are registering in SAM, they must submit a notarized letter appointing their authorized entity administrator. This SAM registration can take 2 or even more weeks depending on their workload. So take that into account. I tell folks you can go get that information and be registered in SAM, and then you can start working on your project narrative and other parts of your application that's outside of grants.gov so that you're ready to go once this information is available and you're registered in SAM. But do realize that you will not be able to actually start submitting your information in grants.gov unless you have this registration and your DUNS number. So once you have that, just some important pieces of information that are required for this grant opportunity. It's especially important that you have your project narrative and statement of work put together. Those are the two documents primarily that are evaluators other than the economists are looking at. But also important information is the benefit cost analysis that's required for this grant program, as well as information on your environmental compliance and any documentation that you already have for that. Here are the forms that are required. Those you will complete electronically in grants.gov, so be sure you give yourself, again, plenty of time when you go to apply. Don't try to apply at the last moment because you do have to submit information electronically. Okay, also you'll see that you can get additional information about the grant opportunity in grants.gov, and it's at the bottom of the synopsis page. Okay, Francis went over a little bit about the process, but we get a lot of questions about how long is this going to take, or have you announced the grants yet, or the folks that were selected for grants. So this is just a little overview of our process. Once we receive the applications, they are reviewed for completeness, those that were submitted on time, as well as eligibility. All of the applications that are complete and eligible then move on to the evaluation stage, and those are evaluated by panels of DOT subject matter experts, and they use the criteria outlined in the NOFO. So again, Francis' tip about completing information to help those folks out is a good one. Then that information is all relayed to our selecting officials. We have a senior review team, as well as our FRA administrator who makes the selections, and then those are reviewed and approved by the Secretary of Transportation. So that all takes some time before we make the announcement for in the press release. And that time, just so that you know, can range from 4 to 5 months typically, sometimes a little less if we have fewer applications. But CRISI, again, we had almost 100 eligible applications last time, so that definitely takes time for us to go through this entire process. So I would say keep an eye on the FRA webpage with the information just to see if that announcement has been made. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Frances, and she's going to go over some of the best practices to follow.
All right, let's go over some best practices. First, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to thoroughly read the NOFO to understand what information should be included in your application. There are 3 areas where we often find shortcomings: the project narrative, statement of work, and benefit cost analysis. I'm going to talk about the project narrative, Amy will talk about the statement of work, and Nate will talk about benefit cost analyses. First, let's take a look at some of the best practices for your project narrative. This is the heart of your application that subject matter experts review as they are evaluating your project. In the NOFO, we provide an outline for your project narrative. And it's really important to include all elements in the outline and the information required in each section. Talk about the cover page. On your cover page, it's important to state if the application has been submitted to another federal grant program. We want to know what year you applied and what program that is. For the project summary, please be brief. There's no need to include interesting or fascinating history that is not pertinent to the project. The 150 years of railroading history you'd like us to know about is considered optional to share. If you want us to know about it, put it in as an appendix. We're looking for 4 to 6 sentences describing your project here. And think of this as your elevator speech to the secretary and the administrator. When providing the project summary, answer the journalistic questions: who, what, when, where, and why, and highlight the benefit of the project. As further guidance here, take a look at our past press releases for grant selection announcements to get an idea of the top-level information to include in a project summary. For your project narrative, we'd like to see detailed information about where your non-federal match is coming from outlined here. I'm going to skip 4 and 5 since I already covered applicant eligibility and project eligibility earlier. In the detailed project description, hone in on your project. Once again, no need to include interesting but ultimately extraneous information. Quantify whenever possible so that the numbers support your qualitative statement. For example, if you have volume of traffic or trip time savings information, share that with us. Highlight benefits and cost figures, even if they're already included in the benefit cost analysis portion of the application. Include photos and diagrams that support the information in your project narrative. And if your application is for work on a railroad where you are not the host, identify the host railroad or railroads and your agreements with them. If there are other beneficiaries to the project, please identify those and include your agreements with them as well. For the project location, be sure to include a map that clearly shows the project. Google Maps is a good tool to use. Include grade crossing inventory numbers in a table if your project involves grade crossing improvements. Include a separate section in the project narrative focused on how the project meets each of the evaluation and selection criteria. As I mentioned before, here's where you get to write your own evaluation. Do not rely solely on the contents of the detailed project description section to satisfy this requirement. It's okay to repeat key points in this section and quantify those benefits whenever possible. Highlight your past experiences managing and overseeing similar projects, including FRA or DOT-funded projects. Describe expected arrangements for project contracting, contract oversight, change order management, risk management, and conformance with federal requirements for progress reporting. Short resumes are beneficial here. Andrea will elaborate further regarding environmental readiness in a bit, so I won't repeat that here. Now I'll turn to Amy.
Okay, so a little bit about your statement of work. Another very important document that we take a look at, especially those technical evaluators. So we do have some guidance on FRA standard cost categories, and that's one way to organize your scope of work and budget. So do take a look at that. Also, a very important point is to ensure that you have consistency among the project narrative, statement of work, benefit cost analysis, and other application materials. So in other words, check those numbers and make sure that there aren't discrepancies. We see them quite often, can be information on a form versus what's in the project narrative and in the budgets. So double check those to make sure that your numbers match up. A little bit about the statement of work. Again, this provides a lot of information about readiness to our evaluators. So do try to follow our template that we provide for you. Use that. Organize the statement of work in discrete and logically sequenced tasks. Provide some appropriate timing for tasks. Again, our evaluators, a lot of them have quite a bit of experience managing and administering these grants, so they're very interested in making sure that that timing is appropriate. Identify deliverables. Those deliverables will communicate progress and completion of tasks. Again, check your budget. Make sure those numbers are accurate. Also, some applicants have only submitted the statement of work template itself. We want you to use that template and fill it in. Don't just submit a blank template. Again, we have engineers, regional managers, other subject matter experts that are on our review teams, and they have quite a bit of experience with grant readiness, so they look closely at your statement of work. Also, I get the question, why do I have to submit a statement of work as well as a project narrative? Both have different information. It's fine to have some overlap in that information, but again, make sure that it is all consistent and not contradictory. So next, we're going to move on to our best practices for the benefit cost analysis. And here's a polling question.
All right. Our polling question is, do you have experience preparing a benefit cost analysis? A, yes, extensive. B, yes, limited. C, no experience. And we'll give it a few seconds. All right, thank you. Looks like we have about 18% with extensive, 43% with limited, and 38% with no experience.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go over the general steps of the BCA as well as some errors that we've seen in the past rounds and what you can do to avoid them. Here we have the basic overview of the process of creating a BCA, and I will go over each one of these bullets individually throughout the presentation. But it's important in the first step to make sure that you are properly analyzing the project that you are proposing. The base case should represent exactly what exists today. What if I walk outside on your site, what will I see? And the alternate case should represent the actual proposed project that you are proposing to do with the grant money. So one common mistake that we see is that people will say, well, we could have done this other alternative, and this proposed project is much better than that alternative. And that is improper. We are basing the project based on what is currently there, not what could be there in the future. It is extremely important as well that if your project is, let's say, a project of projects, to include each sub-element as its own individual BCA. So if you have, let's say, a corridor of grade crossings that you want to improve, you have 5 different grade crossings, you need to analyze each one of those grade crossings individually unless there is some explicit reason why they must be done as a group. And again, the cost of the alternatives that you are not taking are not benefits. Everyone can always find a more expensive and less efficient way of doing a project. The fact that you didn't spend $1 billion on a $1 million project just means you're doing your job. Doesn't mean that you're going to get graded higher for that. And finally, the timeline needs to be appropriate for the project that you're proposing. Needs to match the useful life of whatever infrastructure or equipment that you are proposing to build. If it is longer than 30 years, however, and generally that's 30 years from the completion of the project, then you should limit yourself to 30 years and include residual value using standard GAAP accounting procedures. So it's also extremely important when you're comparing the base case and the alternative case, we're only interested in the differences between these two. What will change as a result of your proposed project? And the difference is, a lot of times this is going to be based on projections and assumptions that you are making. So you need to state what your assumptions are, and then also you need to give as reasonable estimates as can be expected as to what the changes will be. There's a few examples up there in terms of common errors that we see. It's unlikely, for example, that if you defer maintenance in the track class, as a result, you're going to have to downgrade your track class, that you're going to just completely shut down operations. Railroads are very good at finding alternate ways to put speed or weight restrictions on that and to continue operations at a lower level rather than simply not running at all. And equipment will have residual value at the end of its useful life. That includes both your current equipment that you're replacing and the equipment that you will be using in the future. So the marginal effects of the difference between the base case and the alternative case are the project benefits. Those are sometimes negative. There can be downsides to your particular project. So we would like to know about those downsides, and you should express them as negative dollar amounts included in the benefit section, not in the cost section. The cost section are for actual dollars being paid to somebody, not, kind of the economic fiction of what should we value certain negative consequences at. And for the O&M, pay considerable attention to that section in the BCA guidance. If you are constructing new infrastructure or new equipment, then the O&M cost for the lifetime of that infrastructure or capital should be included as a project cost, annualized. If it, however, is refurbishment of existing infrastructure, or it is a replacement of existing infrastructure with let's say, some new, more efficient infrastructure, and you predict that your O&M costs will go down as a result of that, then that should be included as a project benefit because you're saving money. And again, the residual value of your remaining assets at the end of the 30-year period, or even if it's like a 20-year period, whatever your timeline is, those are project benefits and not project costs. Project costs are dollars that get paid to somebody to do a specific task. So once you've thought about the base case and the alternative case and what's going to happen as a result of this project, which, to be frank, should take a considerable portion of the time that you spend doing the BCA overall, it's very important that you go through that process step by step and make sure you've hit all your bases before moving on. Once you have those effects, it's important to break them down into as discrete and small of a sub-element as you possibly can. And the reason for that is, so if you look at the example that we have, project might include replacing a bridge. And somebody might say, well, replacing this bridge will result in travel time savings. Okay. There are many different ways in which travel time savings could be achieved, and it's very difficult to have faith in your analyses if you don't include specifically what you mean by that. So right there are 3 different examples of how a bridge might actually affect the travel time of freight and passengers moving across that bridge and in the region. And they would all be valued differently. They would all have different amounts of time that would be saved. So the more granular you can get in your analysis, unlike the narrative, we want as much detail as possible, throw it in there. We should know all of your assumptions and your calculations in order to make sure that we have the highest possible faith in your analysis. One of the major benefits that people often cite especially with freight rail projects, is the benefit of taking trucks off the highway. And modal diversion can be a tricky subject, and we find it's a place where a lot of people trip up, where they thought they had a great BCA and they did not follow the DOT guidance. So it's quite important to follow the DOT guidance. If you don't, we will adjust your analysis to follow the DOT guidance on this subject. One of the big ones is new and induced users of the system are valued at the 50%. Unless you can justify some other value, you need to stick to that. And over and above the efficiency of the rail system, you need to talk about the benefits to society that taking trucks off the highway have, which we've included 4 possible ones on the slide. And in the same way as the last bullet point says that passenger revenue losses are transfers, it may be damaging to your agency to lose out on that revenue, and therefore avoiding that loss is a benefit to you. That is not a benefit to be included in a benefit cost analysis, because the people who are no longer taking your service retain their money in exactly the same amount as you are losing money. So that is a transfer. It is not a benefit. Similar to that, saving money for shippers is almost always a transfer. If you switch from truck traffic to rail traffic, you will most likely be paying less money on a ton-mile basis, but that is not a benefit to the project in most cases. If you include it as a benefit, you will need to justify that assumption pretty heavily, because there are many other factors that a logistics chain will consider when they are making that decision whether to ship by truck or by rail. And even in situations where the price is lower, people still go by truck because there are other advantages that are not being quantified there. So again, almost always transfers. So just to recap, you need to document your assumptions in as much detail as possible. The more detail, the better. The better you explain your calculations and the sources of values, the more faith we will have in your project analyses, and it'll sail through our review process very quickly. If your project has separable elements that could be done individually of each other, please separate the costs and the benefits of each of those sub-elements into separate analyses and look at them separately. It has been the case in the past that projects of that nature have only been partially funded, and we have to look at those individual elements as if it was its own project. If you include modal diversion, you need your passenger count, you need your freight counts, mix of commodities. Oftentimes the AADT that your state DOT provides to federal highways and to us is inaccurate. So please provide the best information that you have. Otherwise, we will be relying on the highways database for that. And many people have complained that it's not up to date, but that is your state DOT's fault, and there's nothing we can do about it. And finally, the entire package should be in an Excel spreadsheet, should be unlocked so that we can make changes and fiddle with it as we see fit. And we've got a couple links here that you might find useful. The first one is the actual BCA guidance. The December 2018 is the most recent version, so make sure you're using that one. And we also have FAQ that is we're going to post an updated version very soon, but the old one is still available online. That kind of gives rail-specific examples on how to apply the BCA guidance for the entire DOT.
Okay, so we'll continue. Thanks, Nate. So I'm Andrea Martin. I'm an environmental protection specialist here at FRA, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the environmental readiness for your applications in your applications. The environmental process, most commonly referred to as NEPA, is required for all FRA grant-funded projects to document and substantiate our agency's decision to implement the project. And so with your CRISI grant, submit an approved NEPA document, if available and applicable, from FRA, FTA, or FHWA. What that means is if you've had, let's say, this is a portion or a phase of a larger project with a NEPA document, please refer to that document in your application, send a link, send the best information that you have. FRA, as of last October, we're able to use, we're able to adopt categorical exclusions from FTA or FHWA. So if you've had a past project and you've done a CE and cleared a CE, please submit that information with your application. So if there are no previous NEPA documents associated with the project, applicants are encouraged to consider the following in the grant application to the best of your knowledge. What we would like, and you'll have this in the project background, but reiterated in the application or your submittal, know what your project is, know the location, and any possible impacts to the human, which is usually historic or neighborhoods. Maybe you have areas where there's a hospital or a school nearby. That's what we call the human environment. And then the natural environment could be wetlands. If you know that you're going to be staging a lot of equipment or locomotives, air quality, if you're going to be disrupting habitat or the floodplain, that's what we call the natural environment. So write down what your project is and what the resources are within that area. And then any anticipated permitting needs. That would be like if you had wetlands in your area, you might need something from the Army Corps of Engineers, or you need to coordinate with the State Historic Preservation Officer. If you have maybe historic structures, there's a lot of good information, and I think it's on the slide further in the slideshow. The FRA has some good information online. We've been continuously updating our website. So basically what we want you to do is check out the FRA website, and it's www.fra.dot.gov/environment. And the two links that are in the slideshow are off of that page. But there are examples of past projects that are like maybe projects that are currently underway or completed. There's a project list that we have that you can read about past projects that the environmental staff have worked on. And basically rely on experience and expertise to determine the type of NEPA and the level of documentation and coordination appropriate for your project. So if you're not sure what, you can always email me. My information will be at the end of the presentation. But we'll be happy to, or I'll be happy to point you or provide you some resources and tools to help you have the best or the most complete environmental part of your application. And I know sometimes that you might not be ready for that, but we have trying to streamline the process and expedite NEPA, and there might be some ways that we have for historic properties, ways that we can do that in-house and exempt that through something called the Section 106 program comment. It's for properties within the right-of-way, and there's sometimes it's just an easier way to do the environmental if there's limited or no ground disturbance, let's say if it's acquisition of equipment. But please feel free to email me, and I can get you some information or point you in the right direction. But I do want to say that in the past, the applications I have seen, I think every year they're getting better and better at documenting the environmental process and that part of the applications.
Okay, this is Frances again. I'm going to go over some recap and reminders. So Make sure you read that NOFO carefully. Make a determination of what a successful project will look like. Use that checklist that comes in the NOFO as you complete your application. Address all of the evaluation and selection criteria. By clearly and directly responding to the criteria, your application will be easier to read and evaluate. And don't bury your key points in extraneous materials. Some of these seem like statements of the obvious, but we want to highlight them because there's limited time to draft the applications, and we want to make sure you're building in time to do the quality control work. So make sure that your numbers on your SF424 match your project narrative and your statement of work. Name the key partners and include letters of support and financial arrangements. Submit spreadsheets formatted in Excel format, not another format such as PDF. And my last bit of advice is have a cold reader review your evaluation. Back to you, Amy.
Okay, thank you. We get a lot of questions regarding the timing of grant awards once projects are selected. So I put together this timeline. The times are approximate. Sometimes those time frames are a little less. Sometimes they're a little to quite a bit more. So just so folks know what's going to happen. So you will be, if you are selected, if your project's selected for a grant, you'll be working with a regional manager who will be contacting you, and you'll have a team of folks that include a grant manager and other subject matter experts to help you throughout the process. Prior to the time that the funds are obligated or you actually sign your grant agreement, you have to refine your statement of work, schedule, and budget. So some of you have better documentation in your application than others. Some need a little more work than others, but those definitely need to be refined, and they're also reviewed by our legal folks. You also need to complete your performance measures. Those are part of the requirements for this grant program. In addition, the environmental compliance requirements and grant terms and conditions must be completed and approved prior to the obligation of funds. However, if your project is actually just the putting together the NEPA documentation, that's a little different. But in most cases for our construction grants, that is true. Again, this can take between 6 and 12 months or even longer, depending on how that process is going. There's a lot of back and forth between you, if you're selected for a grant, as well as the folks helping you out. So do realize that can take some time. That's also factor that into your application as you're looking at a potential start date. Once a grant agreement is signed and the funds are obligated, then we can start with the grant administration, which involves your project starting, deliverable reviews, invoicing, reporting, as well as monitoring. So again, that time can really range, but typically it's between 2 and 4 years. Once the period of performance ends, the project goes through a closeout process, and that consists of final invoicing and reporting. And that's just a little synopsis on the grant life cycle and approximate time frames for those. So keep that chart handy when you're thinking about your project. So now we're going to move on to the questions and answers.
We thank you very much for participating, and here is our contact information in case you have follow-up questions. Again, I'm happy to answer eligibility questions, but keep in mind I will ask you to tell me why you think you're eligible first. With that, have a great day. Thank you.